Hi, everybody. I'm Jeff Hunt, and this is Human Capital, a Goalspan podcast. On Human Capital, I interview top business thought leaders to uncover the deeply human aspect of work. On today's show, we will dive deep into how to address unconscious bias, microaggressions, and exclusionary behavior in the workplace, specifically using virtual reality. My guest today is Myra LalDin, who believes in the power of stories to create empathy, shape values, change behaviors, and share experiences. She grew up in Pakistan as a religious minority and attended an international boarding school, and in high school, she moved to Thailand. As one of the few Pakistanis in a very westernized school culture, she learned to be acutely aware of social and cultural dynamics. And in college, she studied cross-cultural business management and later cognitive science and behavioral theory in grad school at Harvard University. Myra co-founded Vector, a virtual reality development company that leverages the power of immersive technology and works with Fortune 500 companies. Leveraging her knowledge of learning sciences and technology, Myra then founded VRperspectives, which focuses on VR storytelling to shine a light on the hidden dynamics of the social world through immersive experiences. Myra serves on the boards of Design by Us, which is an Amazon nonprofit, the National Small Business Association Leadership Council, and as an XR subject matter expert at MIT. In her spare time, yeah, right. She likes drinking pina coladas and getting caught in the rain. And I think I feel a song coming on. Welcome, Myra.
Thank you. Thank you. Wow. My team wrote that bio and I'm like, wow, that just covers everything. I don't know if I have anything to talk about.
Oh, we have plenty to talk about. I am convinced of that. And I'm really excited to have you on the show today. And
yeah, excited to be on here. Yeah, this is exciting. Yeah. Finally got it scheduled.
Yeah, actually, after a number of different scheduling conflicts,
yes,
we finally got it. So anyway, happy that you're here. And so, Myra, before we jump into this topic, I'd love for you to share a little bit about your background. You know, I read all these interesting things in your bio. And so share about that. And maybe you can also share what person or thing inspired you to ultimately end up as an entrepreneur in the XR space.
All right, that's a great question to start with. So my early childhood experiences in northern Pakistan, growing up in environments where at one point I'd be in extreme marginalization and another extreme privilege, I think had a really large impact on what I do today. So my parents started, like about 37 years ago, started a hospital way up in the north of Pakistan. There was no medical care. So they felt a calling to go start that. But because we were in such a remote area, there was no schools like readily available for us. So they sent us to a boarding school. And this boarding school was a real mix of like American and British, like even curriculum and things, but for kids all around the world, but we were the only Pakistanis there. From an early age, you know, so when I talk about extreme marginalization, my family is, you know, multiple generations of Christians. And, you know, if you know anything about Pakistan, it's a very conservative Islamic country. And, you know, if you just Google Christians in Pakistan, like a range of things will come up of just the types of issues they're facing, like, you know, things around the blasphemy law. There's a lot of stories and I won't go into them, but basically it's like religious minorities can have it pretty tough in Pakistan. You know, my school, for one, was attacked by religious fundamentalists at one point, you know, with bombs, guns, all that stuff. So, you know, that's what I mean by it's not just, oh, like microaggressions. It's like, oh, like physical danger.
It's actual violence.
It's actual violence. Yeah. So that, you know, the full spectrum of daily micro stuff too, but then actual violence too. So extreme marginalization in terms of being a female in a very conservative Islamic country, being a religious minority. So feeling that on a daily basis, but then also this extreme privilege of going to I'd say one of the best schools in the world, and all the opportunities that brought me to. Mm-hmm. So, you know, from an early age, I was constantly taken in and out of my water. And so, you know, David Foster Wallace has this saying, he says, like, a fish does not know water. So if you asked a fish like, hey, how's the water? He'd be like, what the hell is water?
Right.
Right. So and basically our water is our norms.
Immersed.
Right. Yeah. Like we're constantly immersed in our norms, and we don't know what they are until we're pulled out of it. Right. So for some people, the first time even leaving their state, like the norms might be a little different somewhere else, or, visiting, for example, I grew up in Thailand, like we take off our shoes before we go into the house. Like that might be weird, right? But it's just, and I say quote unquote weird, basically it's just different, right? So taken out of your norm. Like I said, you only know your culture or your water, like once you're taken out of it and you have something else to compare it to. So growing up with kids all around the world brought me in and out of that water constantly, growing up with Koreans and Germans and Swiss, Americans. And it just showed me the different norms. And I think that, really had an impact. One of my mentors recently said something to me that really stuck with me. She said, because you've grown up with and in so many cultures, you don't have a norm. And that's why you can easily shift and adapt and learn to move effectively in different cultures and with different people. And that just really, for someone to say it so succinctly, I was like, oh, that really resonated with me. So like to get to, what inspired me, I think there's so many layers to it, but that's a big one of it. One of them, I had this rich, vibrant intercultural upbringing that helped me see that helped me see like the value of that. But also as I was brought into cultures and into situations in the US and, other places, that I saw the danger of a single story. And what I mean by that is we are, especially in this cultural climate, we see something about a group of people and then we just assume, or we see something about a single person, right? Like maybe like whatever a stereotype might be. And then we just assume that everyone in that group is the same. So we put a single story on that whole group. And this happens all over the world. And it's just increasing as we silo ourselves and we create bubbles. Politically, we have a story of the other side, like religious, So I always think, stories are what is so powerful. Stories at the individual level, right? Mm-hmm. And from research, it shows working side by side and more contact across groups, lessens our biases, because you get to see people at that for who they are as a person, right?
The humanness of
the
each
humanness,
individual.
right?
Yes.
Just okay, I know this person, and what happens is when you get the story at the individual level, you get to empathy, you get to understand them. When you see something that a whole story is being put on a whole group, you realize well, that person wasn't like that. I see the difference, right? But when we don't have those individual stories, then our brain just makes those big assumptions, right? And travel is a great way to kind of break out of your bubble and stuff. But it's, for me, I've also found it that unless you're being really intentional about how you travel and meet different people, you can actually reinforce stereotypes more. And we call this reinforce stereotypes, but superiority. We call it the Superman complex. We saw this a lot when we'd see exchange students from America go to Thailand. They would suddenly think that they're amazing because everyone wants to hang out with them and stuff like that. So I was trying to find, how do I replicate this experience that I've had being able to grow up with people all around the world, to get to know people at an individual level. Not everyone has that opportunity. That was extreme privilege for me to be able to grow up like that. So how do I break that divide and to allow people to see from different perspectives? And story is great for that, and you said that in my bio, that I find story extremely powerful. And I thought that I would be doing this maybe through video games. But when I found VR about 7 years ago, I was like, wow, this is the best tool at our disposal, for empathy, but also just for perspective taking. And I was like, okay, this is what all that, what I wanted to recreate in the world of my experiences and be able to share stories of, cut across these divides. I thought VR is the greatest way to do it. And it's such an acute way to share a story. And it's the quickest way to get that visceral response from people.
Yeah. And I love the perspective that you gave of the fish, and also just the concept of immersion, because when you are immersed in, as you have been, in multiple cultures and environments, it gives you a perspective that one can't get otherwise. So now I'm really making the connection to the VR space and the immersion that can take place there, and how you sort of ended up with leveraging that to help affect change, right?
And I love that analogy that you're using, like how you're comparing the two immersions in water and stuff, because when people say, I brought up the travel piece, it's not enough immersion, right? Because you're still kind of out of it and you're just there temporarily. But the way for real cross-cultural competency is like living there, and being part of it, truly immersed, like you're saying. So that's why, I love how you're connecting the two.
Let's shift to business for a minute. And I'd love for you to share your thoughts about what the true costs are to businesses that don't have inclusive leaders. And the reason why this is so important is businesses often pay, obviously, a very high degree of attention to financial performance and profitability. And that's only one aspect of the business, but it's vitally important for the health of the organization. And so costs aren't always financial, but ultimately that is what can affect change among leadership. And so I'd love for you to share from the perspective of both financial and non-financial costs to businesses that really are not doing well in this inclusivity space.
Yeah. So the interesting thing is it all impacts the finance. It all does. So even at the emotional level, like it's going to impact engagement and motivation and turnover rates, right? Which is going to impact you financially. So just in general, like what is an inclusive leader? It's just a good leader. Like, so I think we'll talk about this later, but I even have issues with the fact that we talk about inclusive or diversity. It's just like, this just means like you're emotionally intelligent, you're socially aware. And that's what every leader should be, right? Like culturally confident. And if you're not, your team will stagnate. And, why will that happen? Like the lack of psychological safety. If I don't feel safe in my team, if I don't feel like there's a space for me to take risks, then there won't be innovative, creative problem solving, right? There won't be, if I'm constantly like on the lookout of like this boss is explosive or like he's just like unkind, I'm not going to have this secure space to explore new ideas, right? So then now you're losing out. Like, let's think about the financial, like you're losing out on innovation there, like, innovate or die, basically. So that's one. The other is I talk about like the leaky bucket problem, where a lot of companies are like, okay, now, this diversity and inclusion stuff is huge. Like we need to have representation. So like, let's just keep dumping in more marginalized communities, or just, get diverse candidates, right? So you can keep dumping them in. But if you're like the bucket at the bottom has a hole of, there's not an inclusive culture, why will they won't stay. So you're just putting in tons of money, again, financial, like you're spending tons of money to recruit and stuff, but you're not doing the work to keep them.
It becomes a check the box event, it sounds like, instead of really creating sustainable change internally.
Right, sustainable change. And then it's like, yeah, it's check the box, and you're losing money by doing it that way, right? It's just like, oh, this is a quick Band-Aid. Also, like if you don't have an inclusive, so again, like if you don't have inclusive leaders, then you're not going to get an inclusive, like you're not going to get a mix of people. You're not going to get a diverse, like intercultural team, right? And what happens there is, we see that by 2055, like the makeup of America is going to look very different, right? It's going to be much more diverse. And you need to have on your team, in order that you don't lose your market share, like your team needs to mirror your consumers, right? For them to understand what is it that our consumers want. You can't, I was consulting for a team that basically was like trying to create hair products or something for Black women. And there was not one Black person on the team, let alone like a Black woman. There wasn't even a Black person on the team. I was like, who are you creating for?
Red flag.
Yeah. So like you have to have the people, look at like the market share, like you're going to lose out if you don't have the people represented who are creating the products that like understand the market, I mean, all of those are financial issues actually, but in general, like, we talk about in the Western culture, we've separated so much of like emotion from like the work, right? Emotion, like how our mind works. It's like, no, those are so interrelated. And, if we look at Damasio's work, it's when the part of the brain where like emotion is, if that part is damaged, you cannot make decisions.
Mm-hmm. I love how you make the connection between the emotional component and productivity and inclusivity and effectiveness and financial performance, because ultimately it is so connected. And
it's so connected.
And there's so many examples in the marketplace of well-run companies and what the common themes seem to be among them. And I'm curious as to your perspective, but it seems as though they almost all have a very clear and compelling vision and core purpose and core values, and they're communicated extremely well, and they build inclusive cultures where there's diversity of thought and opinion in people, and of all aspects, whether it's age, race, gender, religious ethnicity, all of it. And so, I mean, would you agree that that's kind of where that core connection is made?
Yes, 100%. Agree with what you just said. And when you're saying a large part of that is that communication, like what are our core values, our purpose, our vision is, are we actually living it, or is it just lip service? Because that's the big difference too, right? Is if we say these are our values, then are we living it? And then that's where the feeling of true inclusion comes for a team as well. Like we're actually trying to live this out. And when something isn't right, we have that psychological safety to bring it up. Like we're constantly improving. So we talk about the PSA, psychological safety, speak up culture, and accountability. Like that is so important to have that in a culture to keep growing together, right? So we bring that up a lot, like when we do our trainings of do you even have we can teach everything that we can to hey, this is how you should be inclusive and all that, but unless you have that environment and unless you're living according to your values that you say are important to your team, none of this will matter.
I'm wondering if you can provide some examples of some common micro behaviors, microaggressions in the workplace.
So in our trainings, you're talking about the specific micro behaviors. Basically what we're trying to do is these things happen around you all the time. So examples are the leader walks into a room and doesn't even acknowledge you, right? So he might just go straight to, so example, if we're going to talk about gender, he might just walk over just to the male and just acknowledge him and have the conversation, not even make eye contact with you. That's a micro behavior.
Completely unseen and unheard.
Yes. Yeah. You're just not even acknowledged. So micro behavior of eye contact. So a lot of it is actually, body language, right? So crossing your arms when a certain person talks. And sometimes I cross my arms. If I'm cold, I'll cross my arms. But it's all in relation to what were the many things that happened that got to that point, right? Constantly talking over someone, right? And not acknowledging them, saying someone's idea louder than the other person and then taking credit for it. Constantly asking the same person in a meeting to take notes. Now that person can't be fully engaged, right? It's why is it always the youngest female being asked to take notes? Or just questioning someone multiple times, but when somebody else makes the same suggestion, you go with it, right? So these are all small things. So what we do in our virtual trainings is, you're fully immersed, you're the character. These things are happening every day in your life, but because you have not been attuned to them, you do not have the skills to be attuned to it yet, you haven't noticed them. So we're slowing it down. We're letting you look at an experience and shining a massive spotlight on the situation, right? So what that does is now people come out of these trainings and they come back and be like, whoa, I'm noticing so much more of what's happening in the workplace now. Because we basically create a little template for you, be to notice these things. And they'll be like, I didn't realize how much even the smallest thing can have such a big impact on my motivation for the day.
Wow, that's incredible.
Yeah. So just they're the fact that he kept through the scenario, he kept needing validation from my coworker about any suggestion I said, they can feel that frustration, hey, why am I not good enough? Right. Mm-hmm. And if that happens on a daily basis, that when you consolidate all that all those microaggressions, like that really weighs heavy on you, right?
Mm-hmm.
But for someone who doesn't have to face those and their friend brings it up like, hey, did you see how he kept questioning me? They're like, dude, sometimes clients just do that. They just want like reassurance, right? So for someone seeing it from the outside, they'll just say like, what's the big deal?
It's a diminishment.
Yes, it's a diminishment, but they're not feeling that effect of like the constant microaggressions, right? They're just seeing that little moment being like, hey, what's the big deal? So when you go through the virtual reality and you see again and again, it like piles up on you, you're like, this really sucks.
It's almost like a cumulative
yes.
traumatic effect.
Exactly.
On a person,
yeah. The accumulation is what gets you. Yeah.
And then the VR portion, I guess, if I understand it correctly, it really allows you to put yourself into that person's shoes. So
yes.
you can really feel what they feel. Is that correct?
Yes, correct. Where you're getting to experience from their perspective.
Mm-hmm.
And, so you might be Max, who's like a male Black account manager, right? Mm-hmm. And your coworker is with you, Chad, and you're seeing how you're being treated, like you're being questioned about your school and there's like, things like that. And it's done in a very nice way of like, oh, I'm trying to get to know you, like the client's asking you. And it's like, but why aren't you asking Chad? So that's one thing that a lot of my white friends will actually bring up and be like, well, there's nothing wrong with asking about the school. I was like, totally, there's nothing wrong. If you're having a conversation and everyone's like part of that conversation, like, for example, in that scenario, there's a client, there's Chad, and there's Max, your character. And why are you being questioned constantly? Why, if it's just a conversation, then ask Chad as well, right? But it's in that situation, it seems like you're trying to get me to validate, like to prove that I have a right to be here, that I have the education to be here. Yeah.
And so, Myra, when leaders see, or others, non-leaders, individual contributors see inappropriate behavior in the workplace, what are some strategies for them to confront? And I think so many people are hesitant because they either don't want to shame the other person, which is not a good excuse, or they are conflict averse. What are some strategies that they can deploy that will really help kind of solve this problem?
One, I wouldn't just randomly go out and address it. Actually, like to me, that's not, you haven't created the culture for that to happen. So through our work, it's through the VR, but a lot of it, the VR is not the silver bullet. Like there's a lot of teaching that goes with it, right? So part of that is creating the environment of trust and creating the environment of, hey, we're on the same page. We all want the same things. And you're basically creating new norms. So what that does is, by us going through this training and saying, hey, we've all decided that these are the behaviors that we're seeing in our organization. We don't want these to happen. We all are coming to an agreement to say, when these things happen, we want them, what I call called in instead of called out. I say called in, right? So, but what needs to happen first is creating that groundwork of trust and like, yes, we can call each other in when this happens.
That's interesting. So say a little bit more about the call in. So it's the inclusive method of that, or
yeah. So it's basically the way our framework is like, okay, first we're all going to agree on what are the behaviors we want to change. And then we say like, okay, how do we know that these behaviors are happening? So we call it the spot it, right? So like, how will we know that they're happening? Okay, someone's constantly talking over someone, this is what it feels like. This is what it looks like. Someone constantly takes credit for someone else's work. This is what it looks like. So what's happening is we're priming everyone's brain to start noticing it now.
Got it.
So like you said, like people aren't aware, but by allowing us to all sit down and talk about it very specifically about your own organization, now you're going to be hyper aware. You yourself, whether you're doing it, and others. So one is spot. Then we talk about the call in. So the call in for me here is, it's important that you call it in the moment. So, if you're calling someone out, it can feel shameful. It can be like putting them on the spot. The way to call it in is, okay, I want to encode it in your brain in the moment so that you can't really argue later, did it happen or not? So let's say if someone is, I'm going to use the talking over example. If someone is constantly talking over someone in a meeting, so Jeff, let's say you're trying to say something and I just like keep cutting you off. someone else, like let's say on the team, like Linda, for example, she could to call it in, she can be like, oh, Myra, I think Jeff has been trying to say something, just that little bit. What it's going to do is it's going to reinforce for me, hey, we've talked about these things, and I'm doing it right now.
That's great. And it's a very simple approach, isn't it?
It's so simple. So many of these things are simple. It's just like, you need to, I've thought about them, and that's why they're simple, but like,
Yeah,
but they're very, but what I mean to say is like, there's such easy changes.
Mm-hmm.
And if we have that culture of trust to do that with each other, it's so beautiful. Like, just the feedback that we're getting from people of like, this one man who's 31 years, like an engineer in this company, like one of the oldest companies in America, like he has come back and been like, I went to my manager to apologize because I have been doing these things for the last like 30 years, basically.
Wow, that's amazing. What an awareness.
Yeah. Just like, whoa. And the way that we do it is, a lot of these trainings make people feel defensive, right? But because we do it in a way that's, hey, what did you experience in this? You tell me what you experienced. What did it feel like? Have you experienced this? It takes away the defensiveness.
Yeah. And the interesting thing about that too is that when you describe experience is something that a person owns and you can never take it away from them. So if I've experienced you doing something, it does, you can't disagree with me because that's my experience, right?
Exactly. And yeah, to the VR point too, because a lot of these things do start at the emotional level, right? So what the VR allows is, it allows you to go through it in someone else's shoes and to talk about the emotion that you felt as them rather than your own emotion. So a lot of these like engineers and like, companies come to me and be like, they'll never talk about emotion. I was like, oh, just wait, they will. Like, because it's kind of given them an out of like, my questions are, what did you feel in Max's shoes? How did that feel being in Max's shoes? And then you can then it goes. Then people are vulnerable because it's not them, but then it's building the trust over time. And then they start talking about their own stories.
Right. Well, and I just want to rewind to another thing you said, Myra, just briefly before we move on to some lightning round questions. And it's really that how important it is to take this as a team approach. So we're not going to be, we're not trying to affect change only at an individual level. We're being very proactive. We're agreeing collectively what sort of behaviors we're wanting to promote and what behaviors are inappropriate in an organization. And then we're really holding each other accountable with the same objective, right? We're ultimately going after the same objective.
Right. So we create like inclusion manifestos. We create like all these tools that it's like, hey, okay, now you can run with this. Like for the team, we're trying to empower them, right? And so it's like, we all agree to the inclusion manifesto, we sign it. So what it does is it's basically creating a norm of, hey, this is what we said we wanted to act like. This is who we want to be. These are the behaviors. And when someone is not acting like that, it helps us to hold each other accountable to be like, hey, remember we said we all want to come back to this. So it lets you point back to that instead of like just randomly calling people out. It's like, no, we all agreed to this. And like, we all want to be part of this. And yes, so it's a team thing. It's that's how change occurs. Like we're social creatures, we're social learners, and it needs to happen together.
Well, let's shift into some lightning round questions. The first one I have for you is, what are you most grateful for?
I do like gratefulness things like as soon as I wake up every morning. So it could be as little as like, I love my bed. Like, I just love my bed, just like the comfiness and stuff, just being grateful because I have experienced the other side of that, like not having those things. So right now in this moment, like I'm in California, the weather is just amazing. And the weather has such a huge impact on me. So right now I'm just so grateful for how beautiful California is.
It is a beautiful place, isn't it?
It's so wonderful.
It's going to be hot today out here in California, Myra.
I thought it's going to get up to like 90 or more.
Yeah, it will. It will. Yeah. That's great. What's the most difficult leadership lesson you've learned over your career?
One of the greatest joys of being a leader for me is being able to empower my team. So just learning. So, what I'm learning is as I scale is, being able to train people and then just be able to step back and let them like take it. It's so like take the reins. It's so satisfying. Like it makes me very emotional because one, it's taking away things off my plate, which I love. It's, and then just being like, wow, to see where they were a year ago and where they are now, it's such a joy.
Who's one person you would interview if you could, living or not?
Leonardo da Vinci. he was just, I like to bring things from across different topics, industries, just across disciplines.
Mm-hmm.
And I think Da Vinci was so talented in so many areas. Like he knew so many different things, and like he was able to, like, I hate the word synergize, but he would really across the board, and I love that. I love that kind of brain. And that's also why I did not do a PhD, because it makes you go too deep into one tiny area. Yeah.
Exactly. Do you have a top book recommendation?
Yes. Okay. This book is so great. It's The Coaching Habit, Say Less, Ask More, and Change the Way You Lead Forever. It was one of those books that I read a lot of leadership books, but this was one that was like, as I was going through it, I was testing it out with my team. It's great. So practical.
Yeah.
I love it. And so I recommend it to a lot of leaders. It's so, like, you can use it immediately, like each chapter, like you can start using it.
Very pragmatic.
Yes. Very pragmatic.
That's great.
Yeah. The Coaching Habit. I really like it. Yeah.
And so as we wrap up, what's the single most important thing you would want our human capital listeners to take away from our talk today?
One thing would be, a lot of people right now are trying to scramble and, like, we need diversity training. And so then they're going for, like, oh, we need anti-racism training. We need to talk about white supremacy. And all these things are really important, but that's not where the human brain needs to begin, right? So if you actually want deep conceptual and cultural change, you can't start there. And it really is a journey. And so, like, if you're in this space, like, you got to start from building that culture and doing it. Like, it's actually really a fixed process. And a lot of diversity and inclusion people don't see it that way. It really is a fixed process to actually get to real deeper learning and conceptual change. So that would be, I would say, like, just be aware of where you're starting and where your people are starting. And I know that we get a lot of pressure from leaders of, like, no, this is what we must teach. But I've pushed back a lot, and it served me well.
Mm-hmm. That's very good insight.
Yeah. So that might be my best. Actually, I'll go back to that leadership. So it's not specifically leadership, but your question, but it's most recently what I learned was, like, it's like a general thing of, I am the expert in my space. I do know what I'm talking about, and that I don't need to shift just because, the VP of this massive company is telling me to do it this way. Like, I need to stick to my guns and, like, the conviction of, this is my lived experience. This is my expertise. Like, and I'm telling you that your team is not ready to have this. This is where you need to start. You can't, this is step 1, 2, 3. You can't start at 4.
That's my story, and I'm sticking to it, right?
Yeah.
For sure.
And yeah, sometimes being, like, a smaller company, you can get pushed around a little bit, but I'm like, I can't stand behind the results if you do it any other way. Yeah.
Well, Myra, thanks so much for coming on the show today. I really appreciate all the wisdom you've shared.
Well, thank you for having me. I'm glad we found time to do this. It's really fun having this conversation with you.
Thanks for listening to the show this week. We release a new episode of Human Capital every other Tuesday. I would love to know what you thought of this episode, so please email your comments to humancapital@goalspan.com. Human Capital is produced by Goalspan, a performance management technology and consulting company. Subscribe wherever you get your podcasts, and please share this podcast with your colleagues, team, or friends. Thanks for being human, kind.